Stephen Wang, so good to have you here on American Thought Leaders Now. You're a dancer with the amazing show Shen Yun, and you recently were testifying with your sister Lydia in the building behind us today in Congress. Please tell me, what is going on? Why are you here?
很高兴见到你。
It's great to be with you. Today, I'm here with my sister at Congress to share about how my family has been persecuted by the Chinese Communist Party.
So we heard your sister Lydia's story. I mean, it's kind of almost hard to fathom. Your mother has been spent 10 out of 23 odd years in prison in China. Lydia has been persecuted in various ways. She made it here. You've been persecuted yourself. Why don't you tell me the story of your family?
我们家是96年得法的，
My family
当时
started
我还是
practicing
很小。
Falun Gong in 1996, when I was still really young. Starting in 1999, when the Chinese regime started persecuting Falun Gong, all families who practiced Falun Gong were targeted by the regime. Throughout my childhood, my parents were repeatedly arrested and imprisoned. They went in and out of prison. I was very young at the time, and I would go visit my parents in prison with my sister. They were extremely frail and thin, and I could only imagine how they were being tortured and severely beaten while in prison. In 2008, I came to the US, and in 2009, I joined Shen Yun Performing Arts. My sister later told me that after the Chinese regime figured out I had joined Shen Yun Performing Arts, they put my sister and mother under constant surveillance, and they would threaten them to try to force them to share details about how I joined Shen Yun and about everything I was doing in the US. They were constantly monitored. And around 2011, my sister had just given birth to her first daughter. At the time, her daughter was only 3 months old. It was July, and my sister was taken by public security officials to a hotel at a university where she worked. She was carrying her daughter, and they held her there for an entire day and didn't give them any food or water. They kept interrogating her to find out about my exact whereabouts in the US and details of what I was doing. This is what my sister told me later. At the time, I was in the US and I couldn't communicate with my family in China. In 2009, my father, after being repeatedly tortured, he passed away in a hospital. I wasn't told about it until later because at the time in the hospital, my family was being constantly watched, so they couldn't communicate with me to tell me what happened. So it wasn't until November 2009, when the surveillance had loosened a tiny bit, was my mother able to actually tell me what happened, that my father had passed away.
Just for those of us that aren't familiar, of course, the persecution of Falun Gong, that was begun by the Chinese Communist regime in 1999. So that's the time frame in which we're looking at all of this. So what happened to your father in the end? That's the first question. And the second question is, why was it such a problem for you to communicate with your family?
My father started practicing Falun Gong in 1996. He had diabetes at the time, and he got completely better after he started practicing Falun Gong. He was happier and healthier, and he became a better person. In 1999, when the CCP launched the persecution of Falun Gong, they didn't allow people to practice anymore, and they started mass arresting practitioners. My father was one of the people arrested and imprisoned. I went to visit my father in prison, and he was really thin. He was really healthy before he was imprisoned after he started practicing Falun Gong. Based on the way he looked, it was clear he was being tortured. Maybe they didn't let him sleep or eat or use the bathroom or beat him. And I have a feeling they even injected him with unknown drugs that make him somewhat delirious. The CCP's goal was to make him stop practicing Falun Gong and give up his faith. It was a long process over many years. He was tortured in various ways almost every day, and his body couldn't handle this pressure. When the CCP officials saw that he was dying, they didn't want to bear responsibility for his death, so they quickly sent him to a hospital to see a doctor so that his death wouldn't be associated with the prison. In the end, after all that torture had destroyed his body, my father died in September 2009.
You know, I'll just mention that this scenario that you're just describing, we've documented countless examples of exactly this type of behavior of these guards, you know, the Chinese Communist Party prison guards and so forth. So this is very much exactly the modus operandi, right? And then the avoidance of responsibility afterwards. Tell me about the communication, please. Like, why was it so hard to communicate with the family?
In China, the CCP has always controlled the flow of information. The CCP is a tyrannical regime that wants to have absolute control, and they don't want people to have access to information from the outside world. So they monitor all phone calls overseas.
Did they ever try to use your family to pressure you? Because I know of multiple examples of that having happened.
When I first came to the US, I didn't have a fixed US phone number, so the CCP couldn't find me. But they knew I had joined Shen Yun Performing Arts, so they would instead go find my sister or my mother and threaten them. They would say, "Your son is abroad with Shen Yun. You must tell us everything about his activities." They will threaten them and say, "If you don't tell us everything, we will make you lose your job, or won't let you eat, or won't let you go home, or we'll keep you locked up." They would try to use whatever means possible to get any and all information they could about me and what I was doing with Shen Yun.
So why do you think the Chinese Communist Party is so obsessed with this dancer in America and Shen Yun?
Because Shen Yun Performing Arts mission is to revive traditional Chinese culture, whereas the CCP persecutes and destroys traditional Chinese culture. The regime fears traditional culture and values because it's a tyrannical regime. In reviving traditional Chinese culture, Shen Yun also shows some things that are happening in modern-day China, including the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. It will show such scenes of very evil things the CCP does not want other countries to know about. So that's why the CCP sees Shen Yun as the greatest thorn in its side, because Shen Yun promotes traditional values that are completely opposite to the values of the Chinese Communist Party. So they feel very threatened by Shen Yun.
So we're talking about how the CCP is this kind of obsession with Shen Yun. I understand they actually have been quite active outside of China, kind of interfering in Shen Yun's activities.
The Chinese regime has always felt extremely threatened by Shen Yun. So in the beginning, they sent a lot of Chinese performing arts groups to the US to compete with Shen Yun, and they claimed that they were presenting traditional Chinese values. But really, they were using art that had a lot of Communist Party culture and propaganda to confuse Americans. But they realized it wasn't working because nobody went to watch their shows, whereas Shen Yun's audiences kept growing. So they started writing letters and used other means to threaten and coerce theaters in different cities, to try to make them block Shen Yun from performing in their theaters. But of course, the US is a free country, so many theaters didn't fall for these tactics and they let Shen Yun perform anyway. Another thing is the CCP also often sends agents to harass Shen Yun performers. There have been many examples where their agents actually slashed the tires of Shen Yun touring buses so that our performers couldn't make it to the next stop where they were set to perform. And sometimes when we're on a tour, on our break days, when we go shopping at a mall, for instance, these agents will follow us around and taking photos and collecting intelligence on us. Even this year, they're still trying to obstruct and block Shen Yun performances. A few years ago in South Korea, we were supposed to perform in Seoul. But because of pressure and threats from the CCP, unfortunately, a few performances in Seoul were canceled because they wouldn't allow us to perform.
How many people do you think you've danced in front of?
Since I joined Shen Yun officially in 2009, until now, 2023, it's been about 15 years. I've performed probably around 1,500 shows. For every show, a conservative estimate would be about 1,500 or 2,000 people per show. So 2,000 times 1,500, I guess it's about 3 million people, 3 million audience members.
What an amazing testimony. There's this persecution happening in China, and you've basically been traveling the world for 15 years, exposing the realities of it, and also teaching the world about traditional Chinese culture. I think that's incredible, frankly. I want to go back to your sister, because she testified today with you. And she's in a situation where she hasn't even seen one of her children for 10 years now. Well, of course, so she came to America, but that cost her a lot.
Thank you, Nathan. Good morning. My name is Lydia, and my younger brother, Stephen Wang, is here today. When Jiang Zemin ordered the persecution of Falun Gong, soon after, the police came to our door. Despite our cries, they attacked my father and took him to detention, where he faced physical and mental abuse. Next, my mother, Aihua Liu, was arrested. This marked the beginning of a cycle of 11 arrests and detentions. Our once happy family would never be reunited. My younger brother, Stephen, went to the US in 2008, joining Shen Yun Performing Arts as a principal dancer. When the CCP found out, they began targeting my family more, claiming that Stephen was a threat to national security. After my father's death, the police interrupted my wedding ceremony with demands for information about my brother Stephen. I refused to say anything, but the pressure continued to rise. In 2011, I visited my mother on maternity leave after the birth of my first daughter. Police trespassed into the house and demanded the news about Stephen. However, I still didn't say a word. The policeman then threatened to jail and torture me if I did not speak. He even told me, "It would be a shame for your baby to grow up without a mother." My ex-husband worked for the CCP, and his boss was the former 610 office head in our district. His boss threatened to fire him unless I was sent to a brainwashing center. Under pressure, my ex-husband tried to force me to give up practicing Falun Dafa. At the time, I had just found out I was pregnant with the second baby. When I told my ex, she was frightened we would lose our jobs because of the one-child policy. He told me to get an abortion. I only knew two things. I would not give up my belief, and I would not give up my baby. I decided to visit Stephen in New York during summer vacation. I hoped by giving my ex-husband some time to think, he would change his mind. However, the situation in China only got worse. My mother and sisters advised me not to come back. In November 2012, my mother was arrested again and was sentenced to 4 years in Guangdong Province Women's Prison. A few months later, I gave birth to my second daughter by myself in New York. My mother and our family remained separate. And in 2017, a year after my mother Aihua was released, we thought this was the final chance to reunite for Stephen's wedding. However, she was denied a passport because she practiced Falun Gong. This year, my mother was sentenced to 4 years in prison by Liuyang City Court and is being held at the number 4 detention center of Changsha City. She has suffered for 24 years under the CCP's persecution and has been in prison over 10 years since 1999. My sisters asked to see my mother many times, but the court-appointed lawyer refused to help them. There is no hope for justice in China. Even if my mother was allowed fair representation, changing the court's predetermined verdict is impossible. I do not know when this persecution will end. I do not know if I can see my mother again. As long as the persecution of Falun Gong continues, my mother remains at risk of further harm if she stays in China. I request your assistance in securing the release of our mother. We would like to bring her home to New York. Please also ask the U.S. ambassador to China to raise my mother's case, inquire about her condition, and call for her immediate release. Thank you.
Do you think your mom and your sister understand, why this is so important? I mean, you basically continuing to dance with Shen Yun.
对，其实我应该，我觉得我妈妈和我姐姐都是。
I think they're very supportive because it was my mother who first sent me to Shen Yun and helped me apply.
所以我觉得就是我很庆幸有我
So I'm very glad that my mother supported me coming here,
她也是因为
even
我
though
在
she
这里
was
一直
unlawfully
被
detained
被
because of
关
me
押嘛
being
但
with
是
Shen
就是
Yun.
我也在为她
I'm
就
also
是
doing
加
my
油打
best to
气
help
吧，就
her,
是希望
hoping she
她
can
能
make it through.
挺过来嘛，我也在
And I'm
想
also
以前
appealing for the
也
US
是
government
想就
to
是
help my
呼吁
mother
美国
come to the
政府啊
US.
能尽量的帮助我们，就是把我妈妈接出来，也是希望就是
I'm hoping
更
to
多的
appeal
人
to
呼吁
more
更多善良的
kind-hearted
人来
people
就是说
to help expose the
揭露这种
persecution
话，就是
and also
就帮
aid
助这
these
些
innocent Falun
修
Gong
炼法轮功的
practitioners.
善良的人们。
You were a very young boy when your family started practicing Falun Gong. And now, it's 2023. And when you look at the journey from that time, I mean, a lot of suffering, some victories. The CCP threat has only gotten bigger by all accounts. But when you look back at that time, just what do you think?
其实，就是我 虽然就是说
Actually, I
就是
started
很小
practicing
嘛
Falun
但是
Gong
其实
when I was
中
very
间有一
young.
段时间
And
就
there was
是
a period
因为我的父
because
母
my
亲
parents
被
were
抓嘛，相
imprisoned.
当于是我在
Basically,
人
for a
生成
key
长一
part
段
of my
很重要的
childhood,
过程
my
中，我的
parents
父母没
weren't
有在我身
around.
边，但是他们是因为中共的迫
But
害，
it was because of the
我觉得这个对
persecution.
我的一个就是在成长
I
过
think
程
it
中
was
是有
rather
一点
painful
就
for
是
me
有点
because
伤
I
害吧，
didn't
因为我
grow
没有
up
感
with
受
a
到一个
proper
完
family.
整的家庭，一直到我出国之后吧，
And
包
after I
括
came to the
我在美国
US,
这边就是
as I
工作、
started working,
结婚，
got
然后
married,
包括
and
我
when
的
my
儿子出
son
生，
was
就是
born,
说
with all these things, I
这
didn't
些都
have
没
my
有我父母的
parents
陪
with
伴。
me.
对我的婚礼，我
At
的
my
父母
wedding,
就是我
my
父亲
father
去
had
世了，
already
母亲因
passed
为
away at the
在
time,
监狱嘛，她也
and
没
my
办法
mother,
来参加我
because
的
she
婚
was
礼，
in
包
prison,
括
she
我的儿
couldn't
子出生，
attend.
我母亲她也没有看到她的孙子出生
And
嘛，
when
就
my
是这
son
个
was
就是一
born,
个
she wasn't
我
able to
人
see
生
her
的就是一
grandson
些
being
就
born.
是说一些遗
So I
憾
would
吧。
say these are
但
things
是
I feel
我们
sad
也必须
about
要
in
去
my
做这件事
life.
情。如果
But
就
I
是
feel
你
I
不
have
去
to
做
do
一
this
些揭露
because
中共
if we
的
don't
他
expose what the
恶行的这
CCP
些事
is
情的话，
doing,
中共它
the
会
CCP will
它会
become
越
more
来越
and more
猖
out
狂。
of control.
就是虽然你看
Even though
现
they're
在
very
中国它就是
tyrannical
说
now,
它也是很
I
独裁
think
很
it would be
但是
far more extreme
如果
if
没有
none of
人
us were doing
去再
anything
去
to
做这
speak
件
up.
事情，我觉得他们中共会现在
And the
就是它会越来
CCP
越
would
猖，它
think
会
they
无
could
法无
rule
天，
the
他
world
会觉得
with
就
no
是
one to
全世
stop
界
them.
就是我中共最厉害，
They
没
would
有人
become
去
more
抑
and more
制它，它
extreme.
会越来越膨胀。对，
Any final thoughts?
最后就是我希望更多的善良的人们嘛，
I
能
hope more
看清
kind-hearted
中共
people
的
can
邪恶
see
的本
through the
质，然
Chinese
后
Communist Party's true
是
nature and come
来一起
together
来
to
对抗它，来
oppose and
抵制它，
reject the regime.
然后有更多善良的人们能真正的就是
And I hope more
关心
kind-hearted
这
people
些
will
反动
care
的
about the
弟
plight
子
of Falun
来
Gong practitioners
营救他们，
and help
因
free
为
them.
有很多的
There are many
就是
Falun Gong
反动弟子
practitioners
现在
still
在
being
中共
persecuted
还
and
在
killed,
受着迫害，甚至就是
and many families have been
家破人亡
destroyed
的都有
because
很
of
多。
it. It would be great if more
多帮助
people
帮助
could
这
help
些
these people.
Well, Stephen Wang, it's such a pleasure to have had you on the show, and we'll have you back on soon.
OK， 好，谢谢。
Great. Thank you.